morning. Welcome to worship with Christ Church of Fort Thomas, Kentucky. My name is Edward Good, and I am pastor here at this congregation, and I am grateful that you are with us today. Our guiding statement for our congregation is that we embrace all as we journey the way of Jesus. And so we're talking today about one of those areas in the Gospels where Jesus really digs in deep about what it means to journey, well, his way. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. We started that last week. We're continuing that today. We're going to be looking at that the next couple of weeks as well. And so, and it involves the Legos, same Legos that we had out last week. And the Legos that some young people and some older people in our congregation started to build up last week. And so you see some photos on the screen right now, some of them during the service, our in-person service last week, starting to build those together. And so I've kind of started to combine some of them into this piece here, and hopefully we're going to kind of keep continuing that build over the coming weeks. So we'll talk more about how that all comes together when we get to the sermon in just a moment. I do want to let you know that if you are a person who's a member of Christ Church, just about a month from right now will be our annual congregational meeting. That will be in person here at Christ Church. That's on March 5th. So it'll be right after the worship service. We're going to be looking at the usual things you do during an annual meeting, like budgets and electing new members of our church council. But we're also going to be doing two other things. We're going to be making some shifts, some adjustments to our church bylaws that align a little more with our current mission today. And we also are going to be taking action on becoming what's known as a creation justice congregation within the United Church of Christ, which means we are looking at how it is we will officially covenant with the larger denomination about being a congregation that is really committed to environmental and green causes. We'll talk more about that in the weeks ahead, but that is coming up on March 5th, so just wanted to let you know about that. So again, welcome to this time of worship. We're grateful you're with us today. Let us worship God. Our scripture reading today, like I said, is from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Like I shared last week, I really encourage you, take some time and read the whole of chapters 5 through 7. I actually have a mentor of mine who said that what he would do every Monday morning is he would read the whole of the Sermon on the Mount as a reminder to him about how he was to live his life in that next week ahead. Something to think about. We are going to be looking at part of chapter 5, and then we're going to go to the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, the end of chapter 7, that we're going to read today. But again, read the whole. Just read the whole. Anyway, here we go. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think, Jesus said, that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And then moving ahead to the very, very end, in chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rains fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now when Jesus had finished teaching all these things, the crowds were astounded, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as one of their scribes. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you were with us last week, you may remember in the midst of me pouring out this huge bin of Legos out into the front of the sanctuary here, you may have remembered me talking about a Lego set that just came out that is a replica of the Eiffel Tower. Just came out a couple months ago. It is literally the biggest Lego set that's ever been built. It stands almost 5 feet tall. It has just over 10,000 pieces. Actually, literally, it has 10,001 pieces. It comes in just this enormous box, and inside that box are 3 more boxes, and inside those 3 boxes are 74 individual bags of Legos that you use you go through consecutively to build this enormous set. And inside those individual 3 boxes are 3 instruction manuals for building the whole thing up. Each one has over 100 pages. But here's the thing. Of those 3 boxes and of those 3 manuals, one of them is devoted entirely to the foundation of the set. So this foundation is only literally about 2 inches tall. And so out of the total almost 5 feet tall of the set, the foundation is less than 3% of the entire build. And yet it takes up a third of the resources. So you got to have a strong foundation for the rest of the build. And I don't think that Jesus had in mind a Lego set that was going to come out 2,000 years later when Jesus was giving this ancient teaching, or that Matthew had that in mind when he was putting together all of these teachings together in what became the Gospel of Matthew. But the structure of the Sermon on the Mount kind of goes along with a build like the Eiffel Tower, because it starts with what we looked at last week. That, the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who mourn. This teaching about this picture, painting this picture of what this kingdom of God was going to be, what this new build was going to be. It's almost like that's starting out with you're looking at the outside of the box of what the final thing is going to look like. But then it gets into the build itself, and it starts with what we heard today with foundations. That out of the whole of the rest of the teaching, that it starts just in about 10 verses here, and then a reminder at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount. So just a small piece out of the larger teaching of the foundation upon which everything else is going to get built. So it starts with this part that we heard. You are the salt of the world, or salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world, and that all of these pieces that have already been given to you are still going to be a part of this. We'll get into that more specifically in just a moment. So that's the foundation piece that is also reminded at the very end of the parable of these houses built on rock and on sand. But then Jesus gets into the rest of what we have as chapter 5, all of chapter 6, and then the first part of chapter 7, which we're going to look at over the next 2 Sundays, that these teachings are the building on top of that foundation that really the rest of the world is going to see of what's going on in us and how we are living this out in the world. It's a really remarkable structure to the Sermon on the Mount that we're going to look at. But today we're going to start with that foundational base, that 2 inches, so to speak, out of the larger build, where Jesus says really 3 main things. We're going to kind of go in reverse order. He starts out by talking about how not one part of what you have been taught, what they have been given to this point, is going to be thrown away. If you remember last week, I talked about how the Sermon on the Mount wasn't Jesus taking all the stuff that they'd already known and said, you know what, get rid of all of it, we're starting over, we've got something brand new for you. No, it's like Jesus took all of it, poured it all out, like we got here, and said, we're going to build something new. And so we even got something that we've started to build here. Some of our folks who were in our in-person service last week, young and old, came up and started building. And so these are different pieces that I've kind of brought together, right? And we've even started here, this part, with a strong base foundation that hopefully will get kind of built up as we go through the next several weeks together. So Jesus is saying all that stuff, that's still going to be a part of it, right? That's the foundation upon which the rest of this is going to get built. But I really wanted to zero in on those other two parts, the salt and the light. And what Jesus says is really pretty astounding if you stop and think about what you may have heard already. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world. That should give you a little bit of pause. Because what Jesus is saying there is, this is who you are. It isn't, not just in the English, and it's in the Greek as well. It's not something of saying that if you follow these things, then you are going to be the salt of the earth, that you are going to be the light of the world, or you ought to be, or you should be, or you might be able to be. No, it's none of those things. It is simply saying a statement about who you are, who I am, who we are. Those of us who say we are following the way of Jesus, Jesus is saying you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world, whether we like it or not. Again, that should give you a little bit of pause. Because that's kind of scary. Because what that means is that we are those things whether we like it or not. Whether we are being good salt or bad salt. Whether we're being good light or bad light. We are them. We are shining and reflecting something to the world. So these two things, salt and light. You know, the salt part is one that might be a little bit unclear to some of us today. Because for most of us today, salt is just simply something you add into your soup. You know, you're making a soup and, you go and taste it. Yeah, I think it needs a little bit more salt, right? Put a little more salt in. That's perfect, right? But for the people of Jesus' day, it was something else. I mean, it was literally something that helped them survive. It was a preservative. It was used to put on meat so that meat could stay longer and be eaten longer. Because, there wasn't refrigeration, there weren't freezers of the day. So people would salt meat, allow it to stay and be eaten longer, right? But you had to use it the right way. Like if you use too much salt, essentially you're going to have a slightly meat-flavored chunk of salt, right? And if you didn't use enough, it wouldn't do its job to preserve the food. And so when we think about us being told that we are the salt of the earth, there is a sense of this of we're going to be the salt, but are we the salt in the right way? I mean, it's like I was, I think, 10 years old maybe, and we'd gotten a thing from one of my cousins that was a bootleg copy of the Mrs. Fields chocolate chip cookie recipe. And I told my parents, I think I was like 10. I know exactly how old I was, but I was young. And I told my parents I was going to make them all by myself. I didn't want anybody's help, right? So get out of the kitchen, I got this. So I'm making all this up. I'm mixing in the flour and the sugar and the salt and the chocolate chips and the butter and the eggs. I'm doing all this stuff, right? And I've got it all mixed together. And I got to admit, I remember thinking, the dough doesn't look quite right, but, I followed the instructions, right? So my dad comes through as I'm starting to put him into the oven, and he gets a spoon, he takes a big scoop of the cookie dough, takes a bite, and goes, what did you do? I'm like, what do you mean? And so I took a bite, and it was like I was just eating salt. And we realized as I looked and saw these two empty containers of salt that were up on the counter, that what I had done was I had swapped the salt and the sugar. So I put in like 3 cups of salt and like a teaspoon of sugar. So they were cookies, I guess, but they weren't going to be very good. It's the same way with light, that you are the light of the world. I mean, light can be that which is great for us. Like we had a long power outage on New Year's Eve at our house. And so we had flashlights, we had the lights on our phone, to be able to just kind of get around our house in the dark. That's great. That's awesome when light can do that. But light can also be that which is harmful. When I was in seminary, I had to take this kind of twisty, windy road to get from the hospital where I was interning back to Princeton Seminary. And oftentimes I was doing this, at night. It was one of these roads, there's no street lights or anything else like that. And I can't tell you the number of times I would come around turns and there'd be a car coming around and they'd have their high beams on. It was just like blinding. And for like a moment, it's like, okay, am I going the right direction on the road? Because I couldn't see. Right? That's a time when light is not being used in the way it's supposed to. It's still light, but it isn't a good light. And that's the thing for us. When Jesus tells us, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world, what kind of salt and what kind of light are we being? When the world sees us as followers of Jesus, whether it's as individuals or whether it's as a community, as a whole, what are they seeing? Are they seeing a community that looks like those Beatitudes, where the poor and the mourning and the peacemakers and people who are hungering and thirsting for righteousness, that's the place where they're welcomed and accepted? Is it a place of love? Is it a place of compassion? Is it a place of grace? Are they seeing that from us? Are we people reflecting those things, or are we looking more like we're about people of judgment and people of division, people of violence? Honestly, right now, I think what most people are seeing about the church is the latter and not the former. I don't feel like we, as the Church of Jesus Christ, capital C, I'm not talking just Christ Church, but I think about the church today, I don't feel like we are reflecting God's salt and God's light in the ways that we should. And so that's the foundation upon which all the rest of this gets built. And so if our foundation is a little off, if our foundation is being built on the sand, if we're taking that Lego build and we're saying, you know what, forget it. I don't want to spend time on, all those tiny little pieces. In fact, there's one page where you have to put in 80 of the exact same pieces together on one page. 80. That I don't want to do that work. I just want to build that other part. Sure, you can start building it up, but you know what? It's not going to stand. It's not going to stand. And so we got to start with that 2 inches. With that, which is the foundation, both in us as individuals and us as a community. And so this week, I want you to just pay attention. Pay attention to the kind of salt you're being in the world, the kind of light you're being in the world. Pay attention to what you see of how the gospel of Jesus Christ is being reflected to the world by others who claim to follow the way of Jesus. Is it the kind of salt which is the preservative, the flavoring, the bringing out, as Eugene Peterson, bringing out the God colors and God flavors in the world? Or is it that which is making people go, ugh? Is it the light that's helping us see more clearly? Or is it the light that's blinding us and scaring us? Pay attention of what you see around you. Pay attention to what is in you. And let that be your guide as we start to look at the next part of how we begin to build upon that foundation. That's where we're going. So grace and peace and love and joy be with you this day and every day. Amen.